Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So this is a picture of a new college at Oxford University in England. New college is always considerably ironically named because nearly everywhere that's named New College, after a certain point of time, stops being new. There is a new college at University of Toronto that is, you know, 50, 60, 100. I'm never quite sure. I think it's 50 at the moment, years old. There's a new college in a university something down in Florida, which is only about 50 years old. The thing about naming someplace New College is obviously that eventually it stops being new. New College in Oxford is about 700 years old. Um, and it's something that we sometimes forget about here in the western sectors of the New World. This is the University of Bologna, which is also about 1,000 years old, the university at large. This is a part of the old medical school at Salerno, which was a proper medical school around 1,000 years ago. It's considered in some ways to be the oldest university, even though it apparently shut down sometime in like the 18th century or something, and then they opened a new one in the 60s, which is in like a totally different place. This is the University of Paris, the Sorbonne. Um, Apparently, the Faculty of Law. I didn't actually look closely enough at this picture. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because all of these universities listed are literally hundreds of years old, literally, in some cases, 1,000 years old, possibly more. These are universities that have been around for basically 2 times longer, at the very least, than there were Western civilizations in the New World. And it's a strange idea, a strange thing to think about, that you have these institutions of learning that we would assume must have been significantly different, several hundred years ago, 1,000 years ago, because, well, things were hugely different back then. How people looked at the world, how they traveled, how their belief systems, the progression of science, etc., etc., etc. These were all very, very different back then, and one would expect that they wouldn't be, we really wouldn't expect them to be the same. And in some ways, they weren't, as is discussed by Charles Homer Haskins in several lectures that he did back in, I would guess, the 1920s, late teens, on the topic of, as the title says, the rise of universities. That is, the appearance historically of universities in something like their modern idiom. This is a book that I suspect a lot of people will have trouble finding. It's a book that, after my grandmother died, I found it on her shelf, and because it was small and fit easily into a purse, I basically picked it up and took off with it because, I mean, my grandmother was dead. She wasn't going to be needing it anymore. But this is literally, here it is, originally given as the Culver Lectures in 1923 in Brown University. And this was initially published, its first edition, in 23, and this particular edition dates to 57 from Cornell University. And this is a very interesting little book. It's a short book, but it talks about, universities and about where they come from, about how the university as it is constructed today, as we see it today, derives particularly out of two particular elder universities, that is the one at Bologna and the one at Paris. That those two universities are sort of the exemplars of university that lead to the formation of the modern establishment. And the terminology that I wind up using may, of course, vary in mileage and regional usage, but I can only work with the, kind of terminology that I had in university. I'm not going to try to pretend that I know functionally how these details differ in other countries. The thing is that back then they developed faculties just like we have. Some of the details of the faculties were, of course, different. Their faculty of law, how you defined what law was and was very, very different back then. Their sciences were, of course, very different. The two most preeminent areas of study at that time were fundamentally theology and philosophy, because they were considered sort of the most important things, keeping in mind also that philosophy is one of those areas that has transformed tremendously over the centuries. Because, of course, philosophy is philo, love, sophy, knowledge. It is the study of it's the study of knowledge. Now, that meant that when it first appeared as a concept, it was about people who just were trying to know all the things. And so, unlike rhetoric and grammar, which were the two fundamental areas of the arts that were focused on, philosophy was both science and what we today would call philosophy, that is, the study of logical derivations of the limits of human knowledge and understanding. Philosophy is conceptually today about examining questions and following incredibly abstract questions like what is good, or how do you define good and evil, and questions that do cross very, very deeply into religious territory. Philosophy today is about asking and answering those questions, but back then, science was very much bound up in that. But that said, there was so little science and math back then in some ways that it was easily folded under there in kind of a hidden subset. The rise of universities coincided and may have even been caused by the appearance of Arabic knowledge, Arabic discoveries, Arabic preservation of ancient Greek sciences and knowledge. And so the universities were these centers where people who had all of this new stuff, who had all of this Galen that they were suddenly looking at, all of this Aristotle, and you had these people, these masters, who wound up being paid by large numbers of students to teach them about all of this, super important, amazing knowledge. And so this book talks about the fundamental shape of the university, how that works. It talks about colleges of students, about the way that students had wound up in certain schools divided by so-called nations, which were groupings of students based on rough region of origin. He talks about the medieval professor and, how you become a professor, how you teach, how much freedom or restriction there is in teaching. He talks about, the students, because as he mentions, and in that particular chapter, that a university it has been more than once remarked by professors, would be a very comfortable place were it not for the students. But the fact is that, of course, the point of a university is students, one way or another, and thus it's an important topic of discussion, and so he devotes a chapter to students. And when you read this, there are differences. There are differences that you can see in terms of individualism, in terms of what was studied and how it was studied and why it was studied, in what a final examination was then as opposed to how you would have a final examination now. And of course, the idea of the eternal students, those of us who decide, I just want to stay here. I'll just be an undergraduate student for the rest of my life. I'll be a master's student for the rest of my life. Be doing my PhD when I turn 73, and started it back when I was in my late 20s. Most of us who've gone to university will have had at least one friend who was like that, will have known someone who was like that. Some of us will be like that. I would be like that if only I had the gall to try. And the incessant writing home for more funds because I've used them all up, and the letters from parents saying, we know perfectly well that you didn't use it on books and necessaries. I know perfectly well that you used it on getting drunk. And we all recognize this. These are stories and tropes and characters and characteristics that we all recognize from the present. And as he comes up on the end of the book, as he comes up on the end of these lectures, Haskins is very clear that among the things that he's trying to point out in this is that people 700 years ago were people like they are today, and that we recognize these things because there is a universality to humans based on the fact that humans are, well, humans. We haven't changed that much in a couple hundred years. This is a very, very interesting book, and it has, of course, because these were university lectures, it has a bibliography at the back. A bibliography that, of course, was last updated in 1957, so there might be more modern books on the topic, but I think it's nonetheless an intriguing list to consider looking at. It will probably be a little easier to read this if you have a bit of Latin or a bit of French. He does tend to do something that is occasionally aggravating for those of us reading academic works, that they don't translate something, they just quote it in the original language and leave it, assuming their readership knows whatever it is that they've written. I don't have a lot of Latin, and so I do have some trouble with that. But it is nonetheless just a lovely, fairly short, very interesting collection of, in effect, essays on the history of universities. And I have run through basically all my time, so hopefully someone is interested, and if you're looking for it, good luck, because I don't know where you'd find a copy, but I read it and I liked it, so it's on my list, and I will see you all next week.